We are joined today by Dr. Aaliyah A. Samuel and Dr. Tim Shriver. Welcome to you both. Just quickly, Dr. Samuel, as many as you know, is the president and CEO of CASEL, and Dr. Shriver is the co-founder and board chair of CASEL and chairman of the Special Olympics. We are excited to have them both here today, and I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to Tim.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining. We're thrilled to be able to have this conversation to inaugurate, in some ways, Dr. Samuel's second year in her leadership role in CASEL and in the social and emotional learning field formally. It feels like it's been so long, Aaliyah, since you've been helping to lead our movement around this country and even around the world, but it's only the second year. So it's exciting to be in this new phase still of your leadership. I'm thrilled with so many people joining, and I just want to reiterate how proud and grateful I am to be able to be part of the CASEL movement, the CASEL organization over these last 30 years, and CASEL today, and all of you that represent CASEL in the day-to-day work of high-quality implementation of research-based, evidence-based social and emotional learning strategies for our young people, for our teachers, for our families, for our communities. So welcome everyone, and welcome Aaliyah. It's good to be back for our second conversation.
Thanks, Tim. Good to see you and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. So Aaliyah, today we're going to dive in and really try to get a sense of where the field is. A lot is going on. If I could imagine your inbox on a daily basis, I think I'd see everything from research to practice to politics to policy to international questions to kids' questions to teachers' challenges to administrators to discipline issues to parent engagement to adult SEL. I mean, your inbox is probably amazing. What do you think, as you think of where the field is today at this particular crossroads? What do you see as some of the big issues on the plate right now?
Thanks, Tim. And yes, my email inbox from day to day can certainly vary, but I will say I continue to believe that this is a moment for the field of social emotional learning. And one of the things, to your point on politics and policy and practice and all the various components that we touch, one of the things that rounded out last year that I think is important to note is we did come out of the midterms. And as we watched the midterm results, one of the things that we saw was that social emotional learning was not the winning wedge issue that some had anticipated going into this political cycle. And I think what that has shown us is that we really are more united than many may think, particularly when it comes to social emotional learning, whether it is parents, administrators, teachers, even young people themselves are talking about the importance of social emotional learning and what it means, which just goes to underscore that SEL is not a partisan issue and does not need to be. We need to continue to raise that and show that unity. I think it's also important to note that for many of us, fear is what's holding us back. And when we talk about social emotional learning and some of the politics that have been involved, how do we move from a fear of what social emotional learning to really what the hope is for the future and what we know about the discussions that we need to have about social emotional learning and academic learning as we continue to try to recover from the pandemic. And also, I think it's important to note we've seen firsthand that it's not just learning loss that we need to continue to talk about, but the impact of relationship loss. We cannot close the gap on learning loss until we also close the gap on relationship loss and how truly intertwined those are. And then we also now 2-3 years after the pandemic, if we can say that we are entering a new phase of education, a new phase of living. And so even as leaders, we need to continue to learn and grow. And the importance of thinking about adult SEL and how can we continue to be learners even as leaders, because this is a unique moment in time. The world is changing, education is changing, the needs of those that we serve are changing. And so how can we continue to learn and grow to meet this very unique moment of time that we're in?
You know, Aaliyah, you've given us a lot to think about already. I want to just go back to one point you made here, because it's controversial to say that we are not divided as a country. And it's controversial to say that we're not divided as a country about social and emotional learning. Because if you thought I'm just consuming the news as it comes across my news feeds or the television or radio or other ways people get their news, you'd think that we're like at each other's throats on these things. But you and I know, and many people on this call will, in this podcast, this webinar will know this, that when you look at the data, parents, 88% of parents want students to learn social emotional skills like respect and these kinds of things. 81% want their schools to continue, those that have started. And these numbers are all in the mid 80s to 90s. 93% of parents say it's either somewhat or very important for their children to have these skills in school. These are from PTA studies, from Pew Research, from Benenson Strategy Group, from Titan Partners. When you ask all of these different ways of reaching out to find where public opinion is, we find over and over again, as you've said, that the vast majority of administrators, teachers, kids, and parents say yes to SEL, but all we read about is the handful of places where people are up in arms, often without much evidence to support their claims. How do we emphasize that we have a groundswell and a consensus around this work, rather than get too trapped in the divisive rhetoric, which often is untrue?
Yeah, well, there's so many different ways I can respond, but I think where my heart leads me is first just really sitting down and talking to people. And as I reflect on my first year and even thinking and going into the second year, one of the things that I, as a leader, was very intentional in doing was getting out into the field. We had parent roundtables. We traveled across the country, whether it was from Colorado to Texas to Ohio to Georgia. We met with parents on the ground, and parents from rural to urban and of all kinds of walks of life. And when you sit down and have a conversation around what is social emotional learning to you? How do you see it show up in your community? We may use different words, but the core tenets are there. And I think it's important to underscore that for so many communities, they are seeing the need firsthand. And what we're getting caught up in is the differing in vocabulary, how we're talking about these issues. So number one, I think it's important to have real conversations with people to understand what their, and I use this term a lot internally, what their mental model is of social emotional learning. What does it mean to them? How does it show up in their schools? How does it show up with their kids? And to then start the dialogue from there, because the needs of our kids are so similar. I think about it with my own boys, two very different personalities, but nonetheless, they still have similar needs. And so I think being a broker to honest conversations, and not to say that everything is perfect, because there are some obstacles that we have to overcome. We do have questions about implementation. You mentioned the practice piece. How is SEL being taught in the classroom? What should it look like? How do we engage communities and families to have a voice and partner with the school districts and educators on these issues? And so there's a lot of ways that we can broker really positive conversations, but it starts by being willing to have the honest conversations about not only the impacts and the positive outcomes of SEL, but the role that it plays.
Yeah. So I don't want to spend too much time on the divisive or the division question, because I think we're all a little tired of it in some ways. But I do want to point out one survey which we looked at last summer that was done in conjunction with the National PTA, when parents were asked what they worry most about. I think when I came up in education, you would have thought test scores or school discipline. The number one issue that parents worry about is having politicians who are not educators making decisions about what students learn in school. That's the number one concern. The second most highly rated concern or worry for parents is the happiness and well-being and social and emotional well-being of their children. So in those two, the list included about 10 or 15 different variables. Those are the two that were rated the highest. Our parents want our politicians not to divide us over what goes on in schools, and they want their children to be socially and emotionally safe and happy. It just feels like we've got to be more forceful in telling the story that the country, Black, white, rich, poor, heartland, coastland, north, south. I mean, all these ways in which we're theoretically so divided, we're not divided on these issues. What we are frustrated and disappointed and angry about is the way politics is being used against us and against our children.
Right. That's right. To this very point, as I have traveled the country and even internationally talking and asking, I always start with the one question: what is it that you want for someone you love, a young person that you love, whether it's a niece, a cousin, a daughter, a son, whatever it is? Think about a young person that you love or know. What is it that you want for them? And overwhelmingly, to your point, regardless of nationality, race, income, rural, urban, they want their young people that they love to have a healthy, happy adulthood. They want their kids or the person that they are thinking of to have strong relationships. And so overwhelmingly, it is true. We all want the same things, which is why it's so important to continue to elevate the importance of parent, family, and community partnerships when we talk about not only the system of education, but the role specifically of social emotional learning. Because as long as we continue to keep the community and the children and the families at the heart of it, then we will continue to make the right decisions. But we can't let the politics get in the way of what communities want and what families want. And as a parent, I want what's best for my kids.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing you've talked quite a lot about already, Aaliyah, is this issue of language. And let's be honest, there are states that have introduced legislative restrictions on using the term social emotional learning. Some states have said, we don't want that. We don't want social emotional. Oh, yes, we want respect. Yes, we want self-regulation. Yes, we want persistence. Yes, we want communication skills, but we don't want SEL. Other people will say, well, we like emotional intelligence. So one of the questions on here is, what's emotional intelligence got to do with social and emotional learning? We've got a lot of words floating around, don't we, Aaliyah? And maybe we're responsible in some ways for helping people to get around the language chaos that seems to sort of infiltrate our field. It's just a problem in education generally. How do we help people that are facing these headwinds in their states, the bans, the restrictions, the don't use the term SEL, change your language? Can we stay focused and get the work done, even if we have to change the language?
Yes, and I to your point, one of the things that to me coming out of this political season is important to note is that this is our chance to hold the line and continue to use the language of social and emotional learning, so that we don't start to conflate all these other terms. Because even when other terms are being used, like life skills, like to your point, whole child skills, or whatever the character education, when you pull the hood up, they're all the same competencies that we're talking about. And so I do think that we need to get clearer and crisper in how we talk and explain some of these education terms, particularly to those who are coming to the conversation of education without an education background. But we as field leaders and in the field of SEL really need to continue to operate from a place of strength. You mentioned data point after data point after data point that talks about how there is a unity and overall support for SEL. So we need to continue to operate from that place of strength. I think it's also, as we move away from some of the jargon, just to the point I made earlier, getting really crisp, and then also wanting to make sure that we understand that these headwinds and these challenges are coming from a place of misunderstanding. So taking the time to unpack what all of these pieces mean and how it really shows up just practically. And then I
Yeah.
think we need to listen to our educators who are boots on the ground. I had an opportunity to engage with an educator. We were recently on site visits, and one of the things that this particular educator said that was so profound to me is she said, Dr. Samuel, whether we call it social emotional learning or not, we're still addressing the same behavior and needs in our classroom. The only difference is by having the supports and the professional development of SEL, I'm better equipped to manage the behaviors, to help facilitate the conversation. So really we need to be listening to educators at a time when I think the educator voice is being lost in this conversation.
I want to come back to that last point you made, but just before we do, I want to highlight that you've already modeled in your recommendations and in your vision for the field. You're in effect suggesting that we model some of the skills we teach kids. So you've mentioned several times already deep listening. People may be coming at us or coming at the field or coming at school districts or state leaders or school-based leaders, maybe without understanding. The political side of me says, let's fight back. But the SEL side of me tries to model myself exactly as how do we listen more deeply? How do we affirm the truth, as you so strongly say? How do we affirm the truth of the power of this work, the evidence behind it, the promise of change, without ascribing to others malicious motives, or without demeaning others who may not have understood us and may be potential allies if we listen deeply, if we learn how to disagree, as my friend Keith Matheny always teaches, if we learn how to disagree without being disagreeable. Maybe it's great advice to say to all those of you who may be watching thinking, oh, that's easy for Tim to say, or easy for Dr. Samuel to say, but at my school board meeting, they're screaming at me, or in my principals get after me and challenging me, or the state officials in my state are telling me I've got to scrub my curriculum, things like that. Deep listening, disagreeing and affirming what we know to be true without condemning others. These might be really powerful skills that we don't just teach, but we have to model.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And I think I'll add one more is the self-awareness, knowing what we're coming to the table with and how that may cloud or impede or open up that discussion. But the reality of it is, if we look at the data, even forget the parental support and all those pieces, but if we look at the data of what our kids are telling us, whether it's academic needs, and we see the need to address the learning loss or instructional loss, we see where our NAEP scores are, whether it's the mental health crisis, whether it is the social skills and interactions, holistically, our young people are telling us that we have to do things differently. And so if we just start from a place of what does this next generation need from us, I think we'll be in a much better place.
You've mentioned a couple of times, Aaliyah, a big issue, which is parents and parental engagement, family engagement. There's been a lot of talk in recent months about increasing our emphasis on adults broadly, not just on kids, but on teachers, on administrators, on parents, caregivers, community leaders, family members, community-based organizations, and so on. And you pointed out that the pandemic has in some ways changed everything. What are you seeing as the key priorities as we try to think about more effectively integrating parents and family leaders and caregivers, while at the same time broadening our focus to be more deliberate in engaging adults broadly?
Yeah, I think if we could fully solve this question, Tim, you and I would be retired living on a beach somewhere without a worry in the world.
A lot of self-regulation. We'd have to have a lot of self-regulation.
Yes. Well, and one of the things we know is that parents have shown up in a very different way since the pandemic, and they had a bird's eye view as to what both the challenges and the opportunities are. And so I think number one is really not only thinking about how do we support the parents and caregivers who interact with our young people, but all the adults who touch and are involved a child's life, whether it is the cafeteria worker, bus driver, principal, the person down the street, having those connections and thinking about how are we supporting our adults who really are the models that our kids are looking up to. Many of the competencies that we're talking about, I think about another young person that we talked to who said, I think some of the adults that I engage with could also do some of this SEL work. And so the kids are watching. And so I think it's important to make sure that we continue to engage parents in a meaningful way. And another example that I can think about is one particular school has every third Thursday for parents. It is a time for parents to come in and be a part of the conversation, be a part of the school community, to hear from the students. The students actually talk to the parents in a facilitated dialogue with the teacher about what are the concerns that are happening in the school, whether it is social, whether it is academics. So parents really have that tight pulse. And then parents are also learning about the skills, the language that's being utilized in the school so that they can reinforce at home and in their school communities. And so I think the more that we can intentionally bring parents into the conversation will help break down some of the concerns and the barriers around what is SEL and how is it showing up in the classroom or day to day.
It's interesting to note, one of the questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, Aaliyah, is about how do we explain to folks that we're not asking teachers to be therapists? And I bring it up in this context because you're talking about getting parents engaged. I think sometimes we've done not a great job of highlighting just how teachable these skills are for all of us. These are not things that we're asking people to treat mental illness or treat significant challenges around depression or anxiety in the way a clinician would. We're on the prevention side. How do you manage your emotions? How do you listen effectively to others? In some ways, the point you made earlier is these are not options for teachers. Teachers have always had to help kids learn to listen. They've always had to help children learn to regulate their behavior. They've always had to try to help children find purpose and motivation. They've always had to teach relationship skills. The only difference now is not that we're turning teachers into therapists, but that we're actually giving teachers state-of-the-art evidence-based ways to do what teachers already must do. So it's not an either or. It's just a question, as you said earlier, of whether we have the best tools to improve our teaching and our parenting, or whether we try to do it on our own, right?
That's right. That's right. And I would add that, to your point, this is something teachers have always had to do. But the reality of it is heightened now coming out of the pandemic because we have kids who didn't have those social interactions where so much of it was unfortunately through a computer screen like we're doing now. And so we have teachers who are saying, oh my gosh, I have third graders, but they have kindergarten behaviors because that was the last time they were in school. We have high schools that are saying my freshmen behave like sixth graders. Well, that's because they were sixth graders the last time they were interacting. And so some of these opportunities to practice the social skills are more critical now because our kids during critical development peaks didn't have those opportunities to engage. And so we need to support our teachers to have these skills to help manage the behaviors. And the reality of it is, it's not just managing behaviors. The number one place that kids engage with other kids the most and can practice these skills are in a school setting. And so let's provide that support so teachers can facilitate the conversation. Let's have really effective, positive opportunities for kids to be able to practice cooperative thinking, being able to work with others, understanding someone else's perspective, because the reality is they're going to have to do it when they're adults and they have jobs. So let's give them these opportunities with the right skills, with the right tools to support not only them, but the teacher as well.
you mentioned the job stuff. We're not going to have time to get into it in detail, but you know, Castle's been reporting on this for the last 5 or 7 years. What do employers want? They want SEL skills. You know, as the fellow who was running HR at Google told me several years ago, we don't hire people because they're good coders. If we hire them, we can teach them how to code. What we can't teach them is how to work on a team, how to get along with others, how to lead when they're supposed to lead, how to support others when others need to be supported, how to have resilience and strength in the face of challenge. We don't want to teach that. We want to hire that. So this is a big employment issue that in a way, you know, we talk about appealing to different sides of the political spectrum, and some issues appeal more to people who are a little bit more on the left and some on the right, but all of us should care about employability and employment skills, and SEL certainly checks the box there.
Can I just add a little bit there? Jamie Dimon, who's also the CEO of Chase, put out an article where he said, you know, I can hire for all the tech skills and the hard academic skills, but what I'm having a hard time hiring for are the soft skills. And when you look at why employees are terminated or fired from a job, it is 9 times out of 10 these SEL skills that we're talking about. They couldn't work well with teams. They didn't make good decisions. They didn't show up on time. You know, these are the skills. So if we want our young people to be able to not only be employable, but have a longevity in whatever career they choose or pathway they choose, they need to have a foundation in these skills. Also, there has been as we talk about areas of growth and interest, I actually am participating in a professional pathways conversation with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They are wanting to lean in more on the social emotional learning piece from a workforce perspective. And so the business community is starting to reach out more and more to try to get the supports, not just for employees, but for the managers and supervisors and leaders as well. And so I think we're only going to see a continued interest from the business and workforce community because we do have a workforce gap that we need to fill.
Yeah, I know we're going to get to policy issues in a minute. We're not going to spend much more time on politics, but I know a lot of people are asking about this. You mentioned the relationship loss, the relationship gap, but a lot of people are saying, wait a second, you know, the big problem here is academic loss, that people are a grade level or more behind where they would have been, should have been. Shouldn't we be focused on academics, not on SEL? I don't think that question's been with us since the beginning of our field. And maybe it will never go away. Maybe it shouldn't go away. Maybe we should always be challenged to explain and document and help drive the connection, the interaction between SEL and academics. How do you see us making that point going forward? And what are the key frontiers to make sure that it's not SEL or academics, but SEL and academics?
Well, I think to some degree, we're seeing that already, that the districts, in particularly the districts that we have partnered with very closely for years, those districts that already had strong SEL practices in place are actually recovering from the pandemic faster because the relationships were there and were in place. And so students academically are progressing faster and recovering faster than many districts who did not have some of these practices already in place. And so we can't underestimate the role of relationships. And, you know, it's in Castle's name where academics is at the root of who we are and what we're trying to ensure, but SEL is a tool for us to get to the academic recovery. And there'll be some interesting research that will be coming out, I can't share just yet, that showcases how the power of SEL SEL actually bolsters academic outcomes. And there is not a study that I have seen, Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, you've been doing this longer than I have, that shows that there's a negative impact on academics with SEL. So, you know, the bottom line is, and I think about myself, the classes that I did best in were with teachers who I had relationships with, who saw, I think, more in me than sometimes I saw in myself. And so we can't underestimate the power of those relationships, and its role in academics and how students perform.
I want to just share one piece of data, Aaliyah, that I should have. It came out almost a year ago, but I hadn't seen it. Came from the ACT, the folks doing standardized testing. They went in and tried to they do regular studies of school climate and social emotional learning and academic achievement, of course, standardized test scores. They did an analysis that looked at standardized test scores and the correlation with SEL skills like sustaining effort, getting along with others, keeping an open mind, and social connection. They found that kids that are higher in SEL skills have the equivalent of a year and a half of additional academic learning as compared to their peers who are low in those skills. Meaning, if you improve the SEL skills, you do the equivalent of adding a year and a half of education, of content-based education time in terms of academic achievement in standardized test scores, not in grades, which are important, but everybody thinks it's impossible to move standardized test scores. The ACT is saying SEL moves our standardized test scores, in effect, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I mean, I know we've said this many times, and one of the reasons to have a conversation like this is to make sure that our colleagues in the field know this data is available for you, because you're the ones having to present to parents, and you're the ones having to present to school boards, and you're the ones having to present to policymakers and other decision makers, and you're the ones having to share this information many times with kids themselves. So sometimes kids will ask, well, wait a second, why are we doing this? And I don't like this and stuff like that. So it's important that you all on the front lines have access to as much of this data and the arguments that we can make. I shouldn't say arguments, the points we can make. I don't want to be arguing. The points we can make that affirm the power of this work.
Yeah, and Tim, I would even add, I appreciate you bringing up the ACT data, but we even see it with chronic absenteeism. Schools that really have a focus on SEL and students who have these strong SEL skills, they have lower absenteeism rates than those schools that do not focus on SEL, which it goes to show if you're not in the classroom, you're not learning. And so how do you get kids to want to come to school? It's through the engagement, it's through the relationship, it's through feeling like they're a part of the school community. And so I think it's important to note not only how these skills show up on assessments, but also how it impacts attendance and discipline and other components, which we know are important to academic outcomes as well.
I can't help but tell one quick story, because we worked together last week, and we were in an elementary school, and we had the school very happily arranged for some of their leader students to give us a tour, and then we had a conversation over pizza at lunch with some of the student leaders. And at one point, this question came up. I decided to ask the kids. I said, if someone were to come into your school and say to you, you shouldn't be learning social and emotional skills, you shouldn't be focused on self-regulation and listening skills and relationship skills, you should be focused on academics, I said to the kids, what would you say to those adults who came in from the school board or from outside of school? And one or two answers came up, and then one young woman said, I would say to them, you're being a bully, because bullies don't care how other people think or feel. And I almost like it. I just thought to myself, there's an emotional and a social genius in that young woman, because she has already come to understand the relationship between speaking her mind and her truth, to doing it respectfully, but also to understanding how coercion and indifference to the feelings of others turns into bullying and how to oppose it. So sometimes, like right in front of us, the most powerful lessons are coming back to us from kids. I think that's one of the lessons. We talked about this earlier today. How do we help in these debates? How do we help the voice of young people become more prominent? We don't want to use young people or make them into some kind of weapons in these debates. But at the same time, the voice of young people is just amazing on this work.
So true. So true. And let's just add, I'd like to share the other part of that story. That young lady, and these were middle schoolers, mind you. The same young woman went on to say, well, and here's how it shows up for me. She was like, when I have all these feelings bottled up, I can't learn. But knowing that I can talk to my teacher, knowing that I have people who care about me and I can get all those feelings out, I'm able to learn better. So not only did she make the connection to the importance of emotions, but how having to spend the mental energy to hold it all in, how that impeded her ability to learn. So I think it's just important to underscore not only the emotional pieces and the more personal, but how it was impacting the academic piece, because so much of this conversation is, what is the role of SEL in academics?
Yeah, it's yeah, we still got to get better at explaining it, but sometimes the kids do it better. We can put all the data up, and we can have our meta-analyses. By the way, there's a very important meta-analysis coming out that will document this relationship between academic achievement and SEL. A new one, many of you have heard about the one that came out over 10 years ago that our great friend and colleague and founder, Roger Weisberg, was involved in with Joe Durlak and others. There's a new one coming out. Our colleague, Dr. Mark Brackett, and others have been involved in doing it. It's going to come out under new authorship that documents many of the same findings. We think it's not out yet. But kids sometimes shouldn't be any mystery to those of us who fell in love with education, because we in some ways fell in love with the chance to see and watch young people grow and change and develop and mature and blossom and find their power and their strength and their capacity to contribute to the world. It's such a joy. We got to make sure we get that out there. Aaliyah, one of your great areas of expertise you've brought to this field and you brought to your entire career is an understanding of policy, federal policy, state policy, governors, the life of the governor and all that kind of stuff. There's been some real movement in federal policy in terms of making resources available for SEL. Can you talk a little bit about what we all should know about where the changes are, how to access resources, how to find out where the money might be flowing, what kinds of work can be funded maybe in new ways by either federal or maybe in some cases state grants?
Yes. Well, first I'll start with our amazing Vice President of Policy, Lakeisha Steele, and her team have been doing an extraordinary job tracking the funds that are available through the American Rescue Plan, which was the largest investment into public education to date. And also we have received so many requests from districts to try to better understand how they can utilize those funds to support social emotional learning within their districts. And we've seen many different approaches, whether it is through increased professional development, whether it is through actually investing in different curriculum, which I have to put a plug for our program guide, that if there's districts out there trying to determine what's the right curriculum or program for them, to make sure that they're looking at evidence-based, high quality programs. And so there's a variety of different options and funding through the American Rescue Plan, but then also most recently through the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, there's a grant program that has almost $1 billion of funding that can be spent on SEL. And Ed Week actually most recently put out an article on this, but we're happy to get some of these resources out. And there's also funds available through Title I grants and other federal opportunities to be able to expand social emotional learning programs. And so there's certainly funds available for districts and school leaders to be able to access, to be able to implement these, whatever varied approaches to social emotional learning at the local level. You're on mute, Tim. I'm not good at reading lips.
Sorry, there's some construction going on around me. So I don't know if you've heard it a couple of times, there've been banging. So I tried to put it on mute to get rid of that, but apologies for that. I just was going to underscore the point you're making. For many of us who've been around the field for a while, when we got started in much of our programs, and many people getting started even today might look back 2 or 3 years and say, geez, it was really hard to find resources. It's never easy to find resources in schools. We never have enough to do the work we have to do, but it's certainly better now, isn't it? I mean, we really, there are, I mean, it's always takes a lot of time to get these grants, and it's competitive in some certain situations. And, you know, other people in our districts want the money too for the programs they like and love. And, but if we can take advantage of some of these resources, some of these big new dollars, to use SEL as an umbrella, as a field building strategy for a school or a school district, you can incorporate restorative practices work into that. We can incorporate teacher training into that. We can incorporate skills implementation curriculum. We can incorporate community engagement strategies into that. The SEL framework provides, in a way, a foundation to incorporate all those pieces of the puzzle that end up composing high quality systemic SEL. And there are resources. I mean, it's not easy, but it's possible to find them nowadays.
Yeah, and I think too, one of the differences in the funding now is that we're seeing funding for multiple systems, whether it is education or human or health, or even with the bipartisan community safers bill. Like part of what sparked that bill was, how do we address the safety issues and concerns within our communities and also within our schools? So there's a variety of different funding buckets that also are available. So it's not just looking at education resources or funding streams, but also across different systems, including the CDC. The CDC now has grants to support social emotional learning. And so I think it's important to note that not to just look at education funding streams, but what are the other systems that are also supporting? Because the reality of it is social emotional learning touches multiple systems, not just education.
Leah, we've got less than 15 minutes. I feel like we're just getting started. I could have this conversation go on for hours, but I want to pivot a little bit looking ahead. Looking ahead, there are big issues in front of us. There's discussions about equity and how equity plays into SEL. Sometimes that gets some folks very concerned and frustrated, and maybe leads to some of the ideological challenges. There's big concerns about future funding. There's big concerns about how we engage adults in this work in a way that allows for systemic change and not just a check the box kind of implementation. What are you seeing, and what do you think we should be focused on? What, you know, here we are at it's still January. If we were in December, what would you love to have us as a field be able to have achieved during the course of this year and going into even next year?
That's a great question. So I will start, you know, we've talked a lot about youth voice and voices of the students. And I think holistically, one of the things I would like for us to do is to really think about how do we amplify and elevate the voice of our young people and their needs? How do we really give them an equal opportunity to share what this means for them and what they're needing? Because the reality of it is they're the ones who are going to be living in a world that we probably won't be around. So how do we make sure that they have the skills necessary to survive? I think the second thing that is really important is we need to have an honest conversation about the implementation of social emotional learning, and to be able to answer some of those questions about what is high quality SEL? What does it look like in an actual classroom? Because I think that's a $1 million question for both our policymakers and for parents who are just trying to get a better understanding of, okay, I hear all these words, I understand, I think the competencies, but how does it show up every day? And so I think really elevating that implementation piece and what does that look like? And also continuing to keep an eye on the research and what is the research that we need for the future of SEL to really understand the direction that we need to go in, and making sure that we are not only looking at the field of SEL for right now, but the field as it continues to grow in this moment of time. And the one other thing that I think will be a continued need is to amplify the importance of parent, family, school, community connections. We cannot do this work. We shouldn't be making decisions for communities without them. What's the saying? Nothing for us without us. And so we cannot create inclusive classrooms and inclusive schools if we're not continuously including parents and community leaders and families into the conversation. So I think that will be a continued focus really for years to come.
I want to just put in a plug because you've just given me a little opening here to talk about inclusivity. And, you know, I've spent a good part of my career working in and around the Special Olympics movement and what we call unified champion schools, which are schools where young people are trained in a particular form of SEL, which is how to be an includer. Some of it centers on some of the work being done on upstanders, that's been done on upstanders and people who are willing to stand up to injustice or exclusion or humiliation or bullying in their school. Some of that work is involved, some empathy, some perspective taking. It would be wonderful to see the whole field of inclusivity include the discussion around social belonging and trust building for all children. And in some ways, if we let kids lead that conversation, they're already there. You know, all we got to do is give them a little bit of the vocabulary, a little bit of the opportunity to show they're ready. In fact, they don't want to live in a world that excludes, that humiliates, that bullies people who are different. They're done with, I mean, they don't, some of us grew up in a world where that was normative. I think this generation is completely different in that regard. So I'm glad you gave me a chance to put that on the agenda for the year ahead.
Absolutely. And that makes me think about essentially what you're suggesting is being more intentional on the connections. And I think that has to also be at the forefront of how are we making these really critical connections to these SEL skills that we're talking about, these competencies, into broader conversations like workforce, like mental health, like, I mean, all of those pieces that you're talking about. And so I think kind of raising the conversation up a notch where it's not just here's the role of SEL in the field of education, but here's why it's so important in various other capacities and being intentional with those connection points.
I want to just also underscore one other point you made because I think it's so important. I hope to the audience. You mentioned practice, that there are 1,000 different manifestations, I guess, or ways in which we're seeing practice in schools. Mm-hmm. I don't know anybody in our field who's content with the quality of practice today, not because we're angry or because we're behind or because we've failed, but because we have so much to learn. And I just want to underscore the point you made, which is if people come to us and say, we don't like this practice, or we don't think it's being done well here, or we don't think you've got the right, my view, I hope is, well, help us improve it. We're a young field, right? We're a young field. This is, I mean, while social and emotional components and learning have been there since human beings have existed, being systematic about making it better for that side of us, for helping us love to learn, if you will. We're a new field. Join us. You know, if you've got a criticism or a challenge, don't stand outside and throw rocks. Come into the tent and help us build.
That's right. That's right. Because at the end of the day, I think about this particularly hits home to me as a parent because my boys will eventually be coexisting in communities that might be different from where they were raised or how they were raised. And I want them to be able to have the skills to be able to do so. And so I think it's really important that in the process of leading as learners, that we continue to learn from each other and learn with the hope to improve not only the work, but each other and our society, and not to tear it down or contribute to tearing it down.
So if you were doing the summary, Aaliyah, a lot of folks here that I'm just, while you were just speaking, I was trying to catch up a little bit in the Q&A. There's a lot of people asking for more data. There's a lot of people asking for more clarity around identity issues, LGBTQ issues, and transformational and equity-based issues. How do they fit? Do they fit? Should they fit? When do they fit? Where do they fit? All that kind of stuff. Great questions. Great questions all. Do I have to do this? Should I not do that? We're in a phase of enormous creative ferment. We've got in some ways the whole country now has joined the conversation, which is fantastic. It doesn't make it easy. It's not simple, but fantastic. Give us, if you were putting a slide up, so here's the summary of the 3, the 5, the top things you would hope or you want or you think people should understand about where the field of SEL is. I know you started. I mean, I'm gonna give you one because you started with it. We have an enormous opportunity. There is a united country. That would be the first thing on my slide. The country is united behind the urgency and importance of social emotional learning. What are 2 or 3 others you'd put on that slide?
Yep. So the other would be, let's move from fear to hope, which I mentioned earlier. And fear, you brought up, and this is where I think the equity conversation, the issues around LGBTQ plus comes up, of this fear of the unknown, this fear of, well, I don't know this or I don't understand it, so I don't want it. Let's move from that place of fear to a place of hope to say, let's have these conversations. Let's understand where we're both coming from. It doesn't mean that we'll agree, but let's not be afraid of having some really critical conversations to break down some of the barriers to make sure that every child feels valued, seen, respected, and has a place in school. That to me is really important, to not be paralyzed by the fear of the conversations, but let's move forward in a place of hope, to make sure that these young students have a place. I think the other piece would be the deep connections to academic recovery, and how, if we are talking about academic recovery, we have to talk about the school environments, the community environments, the relationships that have to be in place for kids to be able to learn and for teachers to be able to teach effectively. We have to think about that and continue to underscore it. And I think too, this was a good question. I love it when you throw me questions that we don't talk about.
Yeah,
Tim.
just people.
It keeps
Yeah,
me-
people can know that these are spontaneous conversations because.
Yeah, well, and it goes back to connections. That how so much of these skills that we're talking about are connected into every aspect and every walk of life. And I think we've become so insular in the conversation that we don't see how it connects. But, you and I, even having this conversation, we have to have a sense of self-awareness. We also have to have a sense of social awareness, because we come to this conversation from 2 different backgrounds and walks of life. But how do we come to consensus? And so I think really being intentional and deliberate about the connections that we make. So I think that's 4.
I think so. So I'm going to suggest I'm doing the work with you here, and I always try to come up with simple ways to remember stuff. So I'm going to say you started out with assets. We have an asset the country wants. That's the first A. The second thing I heard you say over and over again is we need to focus on adults. This should be the year in which all of our districts, all of the program developers, our scholarship and research really double down on understanding what adults need and how they can best be supported in implementing high quality SEL. I also heard academics. Let's remember and remind people over and over again to integrate SEL with academics. The next 2 aren't A's, so I'm afraid I'm losing my A trail, but I love no fear. Let's go into this open to the country, open to every community, every school, every child. Our conviction has been from the beginning that social and emotional learning is a critical piece of critical tool of learning for everyone. So let's maintain that fearlessness that you've so beautifully modeled for us today, Aaliyah. and be open to, maybe there will be many opinions we don't agree with. Certainly there will be. But that doesn't mean we have to be afraid of them, and doesn't mean we have to close them down. The best in our field will always try to engage all perspectives in supporting children. So anyway, those are a couple of thoughts that I'm adding, maybe just to help me remember a little bit. But I think if we do really well on adults, if we do really well on academics, if we do really well on promoting the asset we have to unite the country, we will fulfill, we'll certainly have had a good year, if not a great one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, I wrote those down because you are quick on your feet. Your homework will be to try to come up with 2 more A's though, so we can keep
Okay,
the
yeah,
A train going.
so I've got work to do too. I got work to do too.
Yes.
Aaliyah, thank you for inviting me into this conversation. Thank you for your leadership of CASEL. Thank you for your visionary and very powerful leadership in our country. I continue to believe that the place most likely to chart a positive and hopeful and inclusive future for our country is our schools. I don't know of any institution or any group of professionals or any place in which communities are more powerfully shaped than in schools. And I don't know any group I would rather trust with the future of our country than our educators. And you are a wonderful example of why my confidence, I think, is so well placed. And I think the confidence of millions and millions of Americans is well placed in you, the teachers. You've had it tough. We know that. This has been a really tough time for everyone in schools, administrators, superintendents, teachers, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, security workers. It's been hard. This is a year when this field will be behind you. So thank you, Aaliyah.
Thank you, Tim.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I think Emily will come back, and close us up.
Yes. Thank you to you both for being here with us today. You've covered so much ground in our time together, and I do wish we had much more of it. But we will be coming back together for many more conversations throughout the year. And a big thank you to all of you who joined us today. We really appreciate your thoughts and your contributions, both to this conversation today and to the field of SEL. We're all working together towards a common goal. Thanks, everyone.